a lot of people who will not be sorry to see the last of it. It has not been a year dominated by a single issue, as 1974 was by Watergate. Rather, it's been a year of painful transition, politically, economically, socially, and internationally. 1975 has been a year in which there were more problems than solutions, more questions than answers. It has also been a year of unusual variety, in the sense of the ancient Chinese curse, "May you be doomed to live in interesting times." Whatever else it was, 1975 was certainly interesting, and its checkerboard pattern will be the subject of this television album of the year.
This is a CBS News special. 1975, a television album, with CBS News correspondent Charles Collingwood. This broadcast is sponsored by Bufferin, the headache tablet with special ingredients to give you fast relief and be easy on your stomach.
For many Americans, what first distinguished 1975 from 1974 was that Richard Nixon wasn't in the White House anymore. Gerald Ford was. The year began with the mopping up after Watergate as, on January 1st, Mitchell, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mardian were all convicted by a Washington jury. From then on, the spotlight was on President Ford, as Bob Schieffer reports from Washington.
There must have been a million pictures of Gerald Ford in 1975, but if you had to pick just one that symbolized the Ford presidency this year, it would probably be Gerald Ford stepping off an airplane at some airport somewhere at home or abroad. Whether it was a state fair in Oklahoma or a party fundraiser in California, whether it was a parade in Virginia or the diplomatic Woodstock that brought most of the world's most powerful men to Helsinki, whether it was a banquet in Peking or just a visit with the folks in Iowa or Texas, Gerald Ford always seemed to be there. He traveled more than 150,000 miles, a kind of road schedule he had grown accustomed to as a congressional leader. It was a grueling schedule, not without its problems, difficulties, and downright weird mishaps. Those difficulties triggered considerable controversy as to whether so much travel was really the wisest way for a president to spend his time. The mishaps began in Salzburg when the president, obviously tired after a long trip, took a nasty fall on a rain-slick ramp. Then came the two assassination attempts. In Sacramento, it was a member of the infamous Manson gang, Squeaky Fromm. In San Francisco, a shot was actually fired.
My God, there's been a shot. There's been a shot.
That time by a woman police identified as Sarah Moore, who had played a minor role earlier on the fringes of the Patty Hearst case. Mr. Ford escaped unhurt from both incidents, but both raised new questions about security around the president and generated new complaints that Mr. Ford was spending too little time in Washington minding the store. The criticism intensified a few weeks later when Mr. Ford went to Hartford, Connecticut, where, of all things, the presidential limousine and a car loaded with teenagers collided in a spectacular auto accident. From the time last summer when it became apparent that Ronald Reagan would challenge him for the Republican nomination, Gerald Ford began to stress his conservative side, hammering away at big government in almost every speech.
The only weapon available to outnumbered congressional Republicans is the veto. I have used it, and if necessary, I will use it again and again and again.
His message was that government should not spend more than it had, and he used New York as the example of what happens when it does. Then came November and an unexpected series of events. Rockefeller said he didn't want to be an issue and abruptly removed himself from consideration as the president's running mate next year. A few hours earlier, word had leaked that the president had fired Defense Secretary James Schlesinger and CIA Director Colby, both of whom had differences with Secretary of State Kissinger, and that Mr. Ford was planning to replace them with Ford loyalists, Don Rumsfeld, the White House Chief of Staff, and George Bush, the American ambassador to China. In the process, Kissinger's second hat as National Security Advisor was given to Brent Scowcroft, formerly a Kissinger assistant. The president went before a news conference to say it had been done because he wanted his own men around him. My guys, he called them. The idea behind the cabinet shakeup had been to strengthen the White House team, but the awkward way it all came to light and Mr. Ford's seeming reluctance to discuss in detail his reasons for it worried even some of the president's closest friends. Rather than strengthen Mr. Ford's hand, they feared the shakeup had seriously damaged what many of them saw as his main asset in the coming campaign, his reputation for openness and candor.
By an iron law of politics, Gerald Ford's political future may depend less on his personality than on the state of the economy. That's most people's first concern. And the economic situation has not been so hot in 1975, as George Herman reports from Washington.
As the year began, unemployment lines had begun to swell ominously. In Detroit, unemployed sometimes had to wait in line 3 or 4 hours for their unemployment insurance checks.
You see everybody that you know down here. Guys from the job. I've seen my brother since I've been here this morning. Just the whole neighborhood looked like.
In mid-January, President Ford put the growing seriousness of the situation into words delivered to a solemn Congress.
I must say to you that the state of the union is not good.
Unemployment figures wouldn't be out until February, but even as the president spoke, unemployment had actually topped 8% for the first time since World War II ended the Great Depression. The Consumer Price Index was rising at around 7.5% a year, half of its rate a few months before. But a residual fear among businessmen that the administration might yet slap on new price controls produced a new phenomenon, the price rebate. It began with the automobile industry. Auto dealers, used to having customers flock to them, suddenly found they had to mix rebates with fancy salesmanship and honky-tonk gimmicks to lure back their departed customers. The reaction was gratifying.
It looks very, very strong. So if we can keep this going, yes, we're going to get our people back to work and get our plants back to work.
But unemployment continued to rise, and soon there were federally financed public service jobs like these in the Los Angeles area. And by way of contrast, Florida did a booming business from those who were rich and those worried about the future and determined to enjoy the present. The airlines came up with a no-frills discount fare. Some passengers considered it a bargain. Congress finally passed a massive tax cut, and the president, complaining that it was too big, signed it. And in May and June, billions of dollars in tax rebate checks poured out into the economy, and paychecks simultaneously rose as withholding taxes were cut for the rest of this year. Ironically, the economy had already hit bottom and started back up, as predicted by the economists. Most economists think the trough of the recession was sometime around April. Unemployment, always slow to react, peaked in May at 9.2%. But the total number of jobs had begun to increase back in April, and the economy was once again expanding. But not very fast, as college graduates discovered when they entered the job market, diploma in hand. And at the other end of the help-wanted scale, black teenagers had a nationwide unemployment rate of 40%, and in some inner cities, possibly 60%. The price index continued to climb through it all. Part of the rise came from energy prices. The president imposed his tariffs on imported oil, first $1 a barrel, then $2. OPEC, the Organization of Oil-Producing and Exporting Countries, raised its prices around 10% in October. Rising prices drove city people to grow their own vegetables to help meet the increased cost of living and eating. But in New York City, the Palace Restaurant opened its doors with a fixed price of $50 a meal, $5 a drink, and a fixed tip of 23%, bringing dinner for two to around $200. And the Palace is doing fine. At the end of the year, the panic has subsided, but relief has not yet replaced it. Arthur Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, spoke for many economists when he said that unemployment above 8% and inflation around 7% shows there's something basically wrong with our economy. And that's the problem for 1976.
The general economic malaise of the nation in 1975 reached the acute stage in New York City, which trembled on the brink of bankruptcy and municipal chaos. Robert Schackne reports.
Protesting policemen who had just been fired in economy layoffs took to the streets in angry and near riotous demonstration last July. The first sign to most New Yorkers that fiscal crisis had become more than a newspaper headline. That was also the week that the garbage piled up because of a 3-day sanitation strike, another protest against layoffs. But the layoffs have gone on anyway. In the fiscal emergency, 35,000 city jobs have been abolished so far. Among them, the jobs of 3,000 policemen, 900 firemen, and 13,000 school teachers. Also, cutbacks in services. 2 city hospitals closed or closing. City construction projects almost halted. But just paying bills produced repeated cliff-hanging crises. The closest call was October 17th, when only a last-minute pension fund loan kept the city from defaulting on $453 million of debt falling due. To keep New York City afloat, the state legislature enacted a series of rescue plans, including higher taxes. But the governor and the mayor kept telling the White House there would be bankruptcy without federal help. For 6 months, the president insisted there would be no such help. In late November, he changed his mind. A lot of people had argued that New York had to be saved, among them West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who said the Western world's economy would be hurt by default, and the mayors of other cities, who said a New York default would have a domino effect and hurt their cities by making it expensive or impossible to borrow needed money. But New York's rescue at year's end was still an uncertain prospect. Federal help was now guaranteed, but all sorts of problems like labor troubles or unexpected loss of tax revenue or inflation could derail the delicate refinancing program. Default had been postponed, but the fiscal crisis for America's largest city was not over.
Amid the encompassing economic gloom, the movie industry emerged as a bright performer, with grosses up something like 17% in 1975. The film Jaws not only broke box office records, but became a national preoccupation as the great white shark became a universal symbol of terror. Tourist-conscious officials feared it would keep visitors from going near the water.
Confused about which pain reliever to take? Laboratory studies compared 2-tablet doses of Bufferin, Bayer, and Anacin. On the average, in 10 minutes, Bufferin put 3 grains in the bloodstream, Bayer and Anacin less than 2. In 15, note Bufferin superiority. In 20, Bufferin 5.5, Bayer and Anacin 3.5 and less. Take Bufferin. It's easy on the stomach, and it put much more pain reliever in the bloodstream sooner. Windex with ammonia D.
Herb, I bought an air conditioner.
An air conditioner?
Not that kind of air conditioner, this kind. Glade Solid Air Freshener. Conditions the air and gets rid of odors.
How do you plug it in?
You don't, Herb. It's an air freshener. Glade Solid. See, this ventilation system works continuously so the air smells fresh and clean.
Fits in the window?
It's not an air conditioner. It's an air conditioner.
Oh, really?
Glade Solid eliminates odors and conditions the air.
A good salesperson gets even better when he works for a smart buyer. So the Banker's Life of Des Moines is offering 2 booklets about life insurance. One talks about policies and their features. The other tells how to compare companies and costs. Neither tries to sell you anything, and no one will call. You see, the more you know about life insurance, the more any agent, ours or anyone else's, can help you. So be smart. Write The Banker's Life, Des Moines, Iowa.
This was a year which saw dramatic changes in the map of the world, both literally and in political coloration. In March, the South Vietnamese began to retreat in the Central Highlands, and they never stopped running until they reached Saigon. The South Vietnamese forces disintegrated as fighting units. Intermingled with stampeding civilians, they fled south along the coastal plain in a route almost unprecedented in military history. Every vehicle that could roll was crammed. At the once great airbase of Da Nang, people fought with their fists to get on the planes that were still flying. Everything that could float was commandeered by panicky refugees. As President Thew's regime tottered, President Ford sought to shore it up, sending him Ambassador Graham Martin and Army Chief of Staff General Wyand with messages of encouragement and prospects of hundreds of millions of dollars more in aid. But the handwriting was on the wall, and the flight from Saigon began. The symbolic first step, a flight of 243 South Vietnamese orphans. It ended in tragedy. The plane crashed, and most were killed. A second orphan airlift made it to California, where President Ford himself was on hand to greet them, a sad little demonstration that the most the United States could do anymore for South Vietnam was to get people out. By air and sea, a mass evacuation got underway. If there was no room on the decks of waiting American ships, escaping South Vietnamese pilots simply ditched their helicopters in the sea. In the end, more than 100,000 made it to America. President Thieu resigned with a bitter speech denouncing America as an unfaithful ally. The North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong supporters entered Saigon in triumph, but with circumspection. The feared bloodbath did not take place. Left behind by the United States, acres and acres of military equipment. While South Vietnam was falling, neighboring Cambodia was undergoing parallel agonies. By March, Phnom Penh was so isolated only an American airlift of rice and ammunition kept it going. Its hospitals overflowing with the injured, its streets jammed with refugees from the countryside. Even the airport was not secure from enemy fire. Chief of State Lon Nol got out in time, as chiefs of state usually do, bidding a tearful farewell to supporters who stayed behind. Most of them, we now know, were summarily executed by the victorious insurgents. The sudden collapse in Southeast Asia raised fears in the administration of the dreaded domino effect. Thus, when the Khmer Rouge seized the container ship Mideast, it triggered a swift reaction. Some felt overreaction.
At my direction, United States forces tonight boarded the American merchant ship SS Mideast and landed at the island of Koh Tang.
An elaborate commando-type operation was mounted to rescue the vessel and crew, to show the world that in spite of what had happened, the United States was still not to be trifled with. Southeast Asia is not the only part of the globe where the colors on the map have changed. Half the world away in the Iberian Peninsula, dictatorships so old as to have been long taken for granted dissolved. Portugal, having exploded out of 50 years of right-wing dictatorship, is still in the process of choosing its hue. In April, the military, who had seized power in Portugal, held an election. The communists, under their orthodox Marxist leader Alvaro Cunhal, were the noisiest and best organized party, but they got only 12% of the vote. The socialists, led by Mario Suarez and their moderate leftist allies, were the winners. But the left-wing military leadership denied them the fruits of victory. There followed a kind of national confrontation in the streets. In towns and cities of the conservative north of Portugal, Communist Party headquarters were sacked and burned. The Catholic Church joined the struggle, preaching and marching against the communists. The national divisions were reflected in the Portuguese armed forces themselves, with left-wing units battling moderates and rightists. When a more moderate military group took over, the Portuguese left mounted a military coup on November 25th. It was beaten back, and for the moment, the moderates in Portugal have the upper hand. The civil strife in Portugal has been compounded by civil war in its former African colony of Angola. When, after 500 years, Portugal gave Angola its independence, it left three factions contesting for power: the Popular Front in the north and UNITA in the south, who joined forces against the Soviet and Cuban-backed group, MPLA, in the center. At first, the anti-Russian groups made progress, supported by outside powers as diverse as the United States, Zaire, Zambia, China, and South Africa. Lately, the weight of the huge Soviet arms shipments and 5,000 Cuban troops has created a stalemate. The revelation that the United States, through the CIA, had been giving covert assistance to the anti-communist groups in Angola alarmed the Congress with premonitions of another Vietnam. Before it adjourned for the holidays, the Senate passed a measure forbidding such aid. This action was denounced by President Ford and Secretary Kissinger, who claimed that it left the field open for Russia to violate the spirit of détente in Africa. Détente had become one of the key words of 1975. It means different things to different people in different places. In Peking, Chairman Mao lectured President Ford on the dangers of American softness toward the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Russia's party leader Brezhnev shortly thereafter complained that the United States and the West were sabotaging détente. When Ford and Brezhnev met in Helsinki last summer with other leaders, their policy of détente was flourishing. A summit meeting between the two in Washington was to have been 1975's centerpiece of détente. But the SALT talks became bogged down, and the Ford-Brezhnev summit was repeatedly and now indefinitely postponed. Détente became a domestic as well as an international issue when Secretary of Defense Schlesinger resigned, claiming that under détente, Russia was improving its position at our expense. Détente was less controversial in space, where the year saw the link-up between the Soyuz and Apollo astronauts.
Very happy to see you.
Cooperation in what had been one of the keenest areas of Soviet-American competition, sealed by handshakes instead of clenched fists. In the cultural area, détente worked smoothly too, each nation vying with the other to exhibit its best. The Russians sent us a stunning display of their ancient treasures of Scythian gold. We reciprocated with an exhibition of masterpieces from New York's Metropolitan Museum. But the relative advantages of détente with the Soviet Union troubled many Americans, and it promises to be a campaign issue in 1976. As such, it will be argued not in terms of Scythian gold, but of power politics. There was a time when the death of Spain's Generalissimo Franco would have been a major factor in world politics, but time and Spain's long isolation made it less so in 1975. Nonetheless, Franco's death presents Spain with both opportunities and dangers, as Robert Simon reports.
He'd ruled longer than any other man this century. He'd outlived Hitler, Mussolini, and several American presidents whom he also counted among his allies. The hundreds of thousands who filed by the coffin were not mourning Francisco Franco as much as Franco's Spain, a Spain they'd known for 36 years. A Spain this one man was responsible for in its cruelty, in its recent prosperity. A Spain which now seemed destined for change. The nation had lost a dictator and won a king, Juan Carlos I of Spain. No one could know very much about the man. On the one hand, he was Franco's creation, Franco's chosen successor. But he had spoken of the need to liberalize Spain, to bring it into Europe in the 1970s. European leaders who were conspicuously absent from Franco's funeral came to Madrid to honor the new king. They came to issue a symbolic invitation. It said, "Join the club of Western democracies." But the first weeks of the new reign were not promising. Juan Carlos seemed to lack either the inclination or the power to strike out against the fascist machines which had run the country for so long. So-called illegal demonstrations were brutally broken up by police. His new cabinet included a few liberals, but was headed by the arch-conservative prime minister who had served under Franco. In the books, it will say that in 1975, the Spanish nation changed from a dictatorship to a monarchy, but democratic freedoms still seemed a long way off.
In the sandy wastes of Spanish Sahara, Juan Carlos faced one of his first problems. Morocco's King Hassan had sent 350,000 of his people to stake a claim to this phosphate-rich desert. Juan Carlos, though quite willing to give up Spain's piece of the Sahara, did not like bowing to such bizarre tactics. Spanish troops stopped the motley Moroccan mass a few miles across the border. The Moroccans soon trooped back, ordered to withdraw by their king. For still another year, the Middle East remained the world's most dangerous trouble spot. Secretary Kissinger managed partially to defuse the situation by arranging an interim Israeli-Egyptian agreement. John Sheahan reports from Egypt, Tom Fenton from Israel.
Kissinger's hectic March shuttle began with only limited prospects for success and ended in complete failure.
This is a sad day for America, which has invested much hope and faith. And we know it is a sad day also for Israel.
But the Israelis were delighted with the performance of their prime minister. Rabin had taken a hard line in the negotiations and stuck to it. While the Israeli army stepped up its training and state of readiness, Washington began to apply pressure on Israel's most sensitive nerve. Decisions on future arms supplies were held up. Kissinger came back to Israel in August and was greeted with the most violent demonstrations Jerusalem had seen in more than a decade. Israeli public opinion was hawkish and anti-Kissinger, but the compromise had been made. The agreement called for a step-by-step Israeli retreat from 2,000 square miles of the Sinai in return for large-scale American aid and intangible promises of goodwill from the Egyptians. The surrender of the oil fields was a painful concession. The Israelis rejoined the ranks of the non-oil producing nations.
Here in Egypt, getting back the Sinai oil fields was a tangible payoff for turning away from the Soviets and following Kissinger's step-by-step negotiations. The price was a bitter split between the Egyptians and their former allies, the Syrians. With the Soviets refusing to deliver more than a trickle of weapons and spare parts, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat emerged early in the year as the Arab world's most moderate leader.
Either Israel or us, no one of us can solve this problem by military action.
Moderation brought a number of gains. Egypt could reopen the Suez Canal. One later concession was that Israeli cargo could pass, but not Israeli ships. The canal brings in badly needed hard currency, though not yet as much as Egypt expected. The Egyptians made their choice in 1975. They decided they want a better life more than they want to fight Israelis. Their biggest worry is that they might be drawn into another war.
At the year's end, it was Syria and the Palestinians who remained Israel's most adamant antagonists. Both were covertly involved in a new threat to peace in the Middle East, the civil conflict in Lebanon, once the least belligerent nation in the area. Bill McLaughlin tells that story.
This was the country that liked to call itself the Switzerland of the Middle East. But in 1975, Lebanon's freewheeling economy was shattered as a neighborhood quarrel swiftly escalated into full-scale civil war between Christians and Muslims. The downtown commercial district was an early casualty. The political lines of the fight were soon clear. The Christians, some 40% of the nation, controlled the economy, the army, and government. They wanted no part of the Middle East conflict and resented the presence in Lebanon of thousands of heavily armed Palestinian guerrillas. The Muslims decided it was time they controlled Lebanon, and time Lebanon started behaving like an Arab state. Hundreds of Palestinian guerrillas joined the Muslim ranks in the fight against the outnumbered but better led and organized Christians. All-out battles were rare. More often it was a duel of snipers. The Civil War even hit the exclusive seaside hotel area, once packed with thousands of tourists. If the fighting continues, Syria and Israel will be sorely tempted to intervene. If they do, Lebanon may turn into the battleground of the fifth Arab-Israeli war.
1975 will go down as a year of rampant terrorism throughout the world. Hardly a day passed without its grisly quota of political killings, kidnappings, and bombings. In London, Caroline Kennedy, taking art courses there at Sotheby's, narrowly escaped death when a terrorist bomb exploded beneath the car of her host, Conservative MP Hugh Fraser. It was part of the IRA export of violence from Northern Ireland to England. In Holland, a train full of people was seized by gunmen pursuing the obscure cause of South Moluccan independence. The engineer of the train and 2 passengers were killed. Some escaped. The rest of the hostages were held for 12 days before the terrorists surrendered. More bizarre still was the kidnapping in Vienna of OPEC oil ministers, including Saudi Arabia's Sheikh Yamani and Iran's Jamshid Muzagar. 3 were killed and 8 wounded, including one of the pro-Palestinian terrorists in the 20-hour siege of the OPEC headquarters before the Austrians allowed the gunmen and their hostages to be flown out. These incidents are a grim sample of a terrorist wave which showed no sign of receding as the year ended. This has been a year of turmoil in the United Nations, incited by the turbulent majorities of the poor and emerging nations. To counter them, the United States appointed a turbulent ambassador of its own, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who vehemently criticized Third World domination of the General Assembly.
Gambia.
Yes.
Yes. German Democratic Republic.
Yes.
Yes. German
On November
Federal
10th,
Republic
the
of...
Assembly passed
No.
by a vote of
No.
72 to 35 an Arab-backed resolution declaring that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Ambassador Moynihan promptly rose to denounce the action.
The United States rises to declare before the General Assembly of the United Nations and before the world that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act.
Besides pressing their own special concerns, the countries of the Third World directed their main wrath against Israel. Uganda's flamboyant Idi Amin came to New York to urge before the UN the extinction of Israel. In response, Ambassador Moynihan endorsed a description of Amin as a racist murderer. The Third World nations failed to expel Israel from the UN, but they went a long way toward gaining de facto recognition for the Palestine Liberation Organization. More on domestic aspects of the year in a moment.
I'd like to talk to you about good things to eat, like Swiss cheese on a crisp Ritz cracker, or a chunk of ham on a crisp Ritz cracker. How about peanut butter and jelly on a crisp Ritz cracker? Everything tastes great when it sits on a Ritz. You hungry? Then have some onion dip on a crisp Ritz cracker. Good cracker. Good cracker.
You probably don't believe a dishwasher can clean dirty pans like this without a lot of handwork. This one can, and you'll never guess who makes it. Just scrape normally. The Super Scour Cycle helps do away with handwork. See? Who makes it? Whirlpool. And you thought Whirlpool only made great washers and dryers.
The sun never stops burning because its inexhaustible power comes from something called fusion, the purest, most efficient form of energy we know. We have the fuel needed for fusion in our oceans. It's hydrogen. Union Carbide is working to harness fusion power on Earth in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. To do it, we've got to heat hydrogen to 100 million degrees. That's 10 times hotter than it is here on the sun's surface. Fusion research is part of the work we do for the Energy Research and Development Administration. The results we're getting could lead to something America's never had before, an inexhaustible form of energy, as dependable as tomorrow's sunrise. Union Carbide, Today, something we do will touch your life.
We stand now poised before a new year that will not only be the nation's bicentennial, but a presidential election year. Already, the major candidates are in the ring or waiting to clamor in. Morton Dean has the Democratic story, and Connie Chung the Republican.
Throughout the year, this man haunted Gerald Ford with talk of his possible candidacy for president. The darling of Republican conservatives, Ronald Reagan traveled what he called the mashed potato circuit, declaring war on big government, bureaucracy, and budget deficits. In an effort to pull conservative support away from Reagan, President Ford tilted right, but GOP conservatives weren't satisfied. They demanded the ultimate human sacrifice. They wanted Nelson Rockefeller off the 76 ticket. For months, President Ford resisted. After all, Vice President Rockefeller had been a faithful team player. He did not try to upstage his boss. He maintained a low profile. He flew south to confront those hostile conservatives, trying to convince them he was not as liberal as they thought. But his efforts were fruitless. The pressure was too great. He had little choice but to withdraw himself as a possible running mate for President Ford.
I didn't come down to get caught up in party squabbles.
Having announced his decision, Rockefeller found new freedom, boldly saying he would not rule himself out as a possible presidential candidate in '76. 2 weeks later, Ronald Reagan formally stepped into the race.
I've called this press conference to announce that I am a candidate for the presidency.
Reagan immediately launched his campaign with an appearance in Florida, where he quickly became the target of a young man armed with what turned out to be a toy pistol. By year's end, the Ford-Reagan battle had already begun to split the party, but the confrontation promised to sharpen in '76 as Reagan suddenly topped President Ford by 8 points in a public opinion poll.
For the Democrats, campaign '76 didn't begin in '75. It began in '74 and accelerated this year.
I'm a candidate for president.
To announce my candidacy for President of the United States.
To announce my candidacy for the presidency of the United States to participate in the Democratic primaries in the year 1976.
Now there are 10 major Democratic candidates. In January, likely there will be 11. Senator Church. 11 Democratic candidates, candidates from right and left and from the middle of the road, campaigning here and there. The 11, 1 congressman, 4 senators, and a former senator, 2 governors and 2 former governors, and a man who ran for vice president in 1972, a man with a Kennedy connection. There is a temptation to call them the Democratic 11 and make use of football cliches. And there's a temptation to call them the unleavened 11 because no one has begun to rise. The polls indicate that 2 politicians who aren't running are faring better with Democratic voters than the candidates who are running. Senator Kennedy, still a favorite of many Democratic voters, has said with finality that he won't run, while Senator Humphrey, who has risen dramatically in the polls, says he won't seek the nomination, but wants the nomination to seek him. There has been no true test of anyone's candidacy and won't be till the primaries. The campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, crowded and wide open.
The legacy of Watergate still haunts American political life. Among other things, it opened the gates on revelations of the workings of our most secret government agencies, the CIA and the FBI. Dan Shore tells of what 1975 has uncovered about them from Washington.
First, in response to reports of CIA domestic surveillance in the 1960s, a presidential commission, headed by Vice President Rockefeller. It generally confirmed that under pressure from Presidents Johnson and Nixon, the CIA had brought foreign spying home. Also disclosed that for more than 20 years, the CIA had been opening mail from Russia and sometimes China. Later, a congressional inquiry disclosed that senators' mail fell into the CIA net. Also in the Rockefeller report, the disclosure that the CIA had potent poisons to be dispensed with a dart gun, among other methods, which it held onto even after President Nixon had ordered destruction to comply with international treaty. One subject the Rockefeller Commission investigated was kept under wraps on President Ford's order: CIA assassination plots, a subject so sensitive that the president preferred to toss that to the Senate.
We have hard evidence that the CIA was involved in assassination plots.
The Senate Intelligence Committee spent another 5 months questioning in executive session witnesses ranging from mafia figures to former presidential advisors, trying to establish not only who had done what, but who had ordered it. That turned out to be the harder part. In most cases, the chain of command had been blotted out.
As far as I know, the CIA was never responsible for assassinating any foreign leaders.
But Senator Frank Church's committee, in a report, concluded that the CIA was involved in plans which indirectly led to the death of Rafael Trujillo, the Dominican dictator, No Dinh Diem of South Vietnam, and Army Commander Rene Schneider in Chile. And more directly, but unsuccessfully, it tried to kill Lumumba of the Congo, and 8 different times, often in cahoots with the mafia, Castro of Cuba, its chief and longest-term target. A separate report on Chile, chosen as a prime example of covert operations, showed that on presidential orders, the CIA spent 10 years and more than $13 million maintaining pressure against leftist Salvador Allende. A Nixon-ordered military coup against Allende in 1970, failing to develop, but helping to lead to the 73 coup that succeeded without direct U.S. participation. In 1975, the FBI was also revealed to have overstepped the limits of investigation, spying on and trying to blackmail, possibly even to force into suicide, the Reverend Martin Luther King as part of J. Edgar Hoover's vendetta with the civil rights leader. There was, this year, one CIA sensation that did not involve wrongdoing, that the CIA spent more than $300 million on a fabulous ship, the Glomar Explorer, operated by the Howard Hughes organization, that tried to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the Pacific, and partly succeeded. Director William Colby, who had not been personally involved in the wrongdoing, but who presided over the CIA's ordeal of disclosure, sometimes too candidly, the White House thought, he was asked to resign. His mission, almost impossible, was done. The design of future intelligence operations becomes the business of 1976 and Colby's successor, George Bush. The aim is to ensure that never again can secret agencies conduct their own secret plots. But Angola replacing Chile as the issue left America still coping with the problem of how an open society does anything in secret.
A calendar year seldom in itself marks the beginning or the end of things, but rather exemplifies long-term trends which began before and may continue later. 1975 was no exception. 1975 was International Women's Year, celebrated by parades, demonstrations, and a huge international women's conference in Mexico City. Even without that official designation, women were in the spotlight as almost never before. They were deep in politics at home and abroad. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party and thus the first woman to head Her Majesty's loyal opposition. In India, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi scuttled most of her country's burgeoning democratic tradition in order to remain in power. Argentina's economic and political anarchy sent President Isabel Perón on a rest cure for nervous exhaustion. She recovered, but faced with military disaffection, her days in power may be numbered. Here at home, women advanced, retreated, fell astray. In the musical world, Sarah Caldwell became the first woman to conduct at New York's Metropolitan Opera. And Antonia Bricco finally got the recognition her long career as a conductor merited. The first women's bank opened in New York with a rush of depositors. But the Equal Rights Amendment picked up only one more state this year, North Dakota, and is still 4 short of those necessary for adoption. And voters in New York and New Jersey rejected such amendments to their state constitutions. Betty Ford, a champion of ERA, established herself as the most active and outspoken First Lady since Eleanor Roosevelt.
I do not believe
that being First Lady should prevent me from expressing my ideas.
And it didn't. Not even when Morley Safer asked her about the possibility of her teenage daughter having an affair.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I would think she's a perfectly normal human being, like all young girls. If she wanted to continue it, I would certainly counsel and advise her on the subject.
That sort of talk is supposed to be bad politics, but the polls indicated public opinion strongly supported Mrs. Ford. Other women in the news were something else again. Patty Hearst had the distinction of being the year's most wanted fugitive. Her dramatic capture and the subsequent legal maneuvers still leave more questions about her activities unanswered than resolved. It also happened that the two persons who most conspicuously tried to assassinate the President of the United States were women. Thus, women were more prominent in the year's history than ever, for both good and ill, making it an International Women's Year, all right, if not altogether the kind the organizers envisaged. Not so long ago, if you asked a sports fan for figures, he'd give you batting averages, won and lost records, pass completions, and so on. Today, he'd probably reply in dollars and cents, for professional athletes have become famous as much for the size of their salaries as for their special talents. This year, Catfish Hunter began his 5-year, $3.7 million contract with the New York Yankees. Hunter won 23 games, but failed to pitch New York to a pennant. There are now 30 baseball players who earn more than $100,000 a year. The Boston Red Sox and the Cincinnati Reds, who have their share of them, met in one of the most exciting World Series in many years. The Ali Frazier fight number 3 lived up to its advanced billing as the Thriller in Manila. It turned out to be one of the hardest fought and richest championships of all time. The racing event of the year was the $350,000 match race between Kentucky Derby winner Foolish Pleasure and undefeated Ruffian, the best filly to race in more than a generation. But the match ended in tragedy when Ruffian broke down and had to be destroyed. 1975 was a financially rewarding year for tennis players, and particularly Jimmy Connors, who collected nearly $500,000. Archie Griffin, Ohio State's running star, was the first to win the Heisman Trophy twice. But Archie and other would-be pros had better have good agents, because there are signs that the era of exaggerated sums is coming to an end. The proliferation of sporting events has gone about as far as it can go. In the fall, the World Football League went bust to the tune of $30 million. More and more teams in every sport are losing money and trying to deal off their high-salaried players. 3 American Basketball Association teams have folded. Professional athletes may never have to play for slave wages, but many may look back on 1975 as the year when the really big money ran out. A change in the Supreme Court is always important. This year's even more dramatic than usual. Justice William O. Douglas, undercut by ill health, resigned. He had not only served on the court longer than anyone in its history, 36 years, he was one of its most controversial members, so liberal in his views that as a congressman, President Ford tried to impeach him. Douglas had a clear view of the Constitution it was his duty to interpret.
You see, the great thing about our Constitution, as I see it, is that people don't generally appreciate is that it was designed to take government off the backs of people.
President Ford chose Judge John Paul Stevens from the Federal Court of Appeals in Chicago to replace Douglas. Although not well known as a jurist, Justice Stevens gets high marks from fellow lawyers, but John Paul Stevens is unlikely to be another William O. Douglas. This year, as every year, our human environment was diminished by the death of some of the best, or best known, not always the same thing, among us. Elijah Muhammad, leader of the black Muslims and spiritual shepherd of heavyweight fighter Muhammad Ali, succumbed in February at 77. Aristotle Onassis, the legendary Greek shipping tycoon who married Jacqueline Kennedy, died in March. In the same month, King Faisal, the feudal monarch of oil-rich Saudi Arabia, was assassinated by a nephew. Josephine Baker, the American singer and dancer who 50 years ago tied a string of bananas around her waist and became the toast of Paris and an international celebrity, was 68 when she died in April. Also in April, Chiang Kai-shek, wartime leader of China, then overthrown by Mao Zedong's communists, died in his nationalist stronghold of Taiwan at the age of 87. One of America's great actors, Frederick March, died the same month. Hercule Poirot, a fictional detective as alive to many as a real person, was put to rest by his creator, Dame Agatha Christie, after solving many a famous crime, including Murder on the Orient Express. His age was unknown. The world of music lost Dmitri Shostakovich in August. He was the Soviet Union's most celebrated composer. Haile Selassie, the last emperor of Ethiopia's 3,000-year-old monarchy, deposed last year, died in August. A colorful figure in quite another sphere, Casey Stengel, passed away the following month. The amazing Stengel contributed much not only to baseball, but to the usage of the language. He'll be remembered in dictionaries as well as record books. Arnold Toynbee, the British historian who took the whole range of civilization for his subject, died in October at the age of 86. This month, death came to Thornton Wilder, one of the seminal figures in modern American writing. He had won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. This does not exhaust the list of the famous and obscure who departed this life in the last 12 months. It's not only each year, but each day which takes its toll. The manifold buffetings of 1975 have taken their toll on American morale. For the first time since such attitudes began to be measured in 1959, most Americans say they lost ground in their standard of living this year. Most of those over 50 think they'll be worse off still by 1980. Another indication that all is not well with our society is the growing crime rate, up 18% according to the latest figures. 1 American in every 10,000 was murdered, usually with firearms. Thus, if you're part of a crowd of 50,000 at a football game, you can figure that 5 people in that stadium are likely to be murdered in the next 12 months. While more Americans are in colleges or universities than ever before, 11 million, they seem to be learning less. Various surveys report a decline in basic literacy and the ability to handle figures. 20% of Americans can't even address an envelope properly. Numerous studies tell us, as though we needed to be told, of a decline of confidence in basic American institutions, government, politicians, the church, not to mention New York City bonds. The public showed its lack of faith in one such institution, the stock market, by getting out. Those holding common stocks have fallen from 30 million in 1970 to 25 million this year. It was thus in a mood of doubt and self-doubt that Americans approached the advent of the Bicentennial year, conceived as a celebration of the nation's basic principles and its continuing faith in itself.
Fire!
1975 may not have been the best possible prelude for such an affirmation, but the bicentennial events began to get underway nonetheless, if only because a lot of things happened in 1775 as well as 1776. Thus, there has been a simulated battle of Lexington and Concord and a simulated battle of Bunker Hill, complete with simulated casualties. The U.S. Park Service has simulated revolutionary cannon and fire. Symbols of the bicentennial already proliferate. The flag makers haven't done such business for years in anticipation of the bicentennial events to come. All this will gather momentum in 1976. But aside from the fun and game side of it, at the end of 1975, the American nation seemed in small mood for large celebrations of national virtue. Perhaps the Republic is not as virtuous as it was in those more innocent days 2 centuries ago. Still, it is no small achievement to have survived 200 years, including this difficult year of 1975. I'm Charles Collingwood. Good night.
When I've got a nasty cold, my husband babies me. Look at all these medicines. All I really need is Vicks NyQuil, the nighttime cold medicine. NyQuil relieves the sneezing and stuffy head cold capsules do. Coughs and scratchy throat like cough syrups. Aches like a pain reliever. NyQuil alone does all that so I can get the rest I need.
Have you got everything you need, dear?
I sure do.
NyQuil alone does it all.
Make every day count. Do what you really want to do. Every day, every day, every day. Make every day count. Do what you really want to do.
You want to make every day count, but you've got to be at your best. So get your rest, exercise, and take Geritol to be sure you're getting enough iron and some very important vitamins. Geritol, every day.
Make every day count.
You don't buy a color TV every day. So you should be interested in the opinion of independent TV service technicians. In this nationwide survey, they selected one brand more than any other for best picture, fewest repairs, Zenith. That's the service technician's opinion. It's Zenith for best picture, Zenith for fewest repairs. The two things you want most in one color TV. At Zenith, the quality goes in before the name goes on.
Confused about which pain reliever to take? Laboratory studies compared 2-tablet doses of Bufferin, Bayer, and Anacin. On the average, in 10 minutes, Bufferin put 3 grains in the bloodstream, Bayer and Anacin less than 2. In 15, note Bufferin superiority. In 20, Bufferin 5.5, Bayer and Anacin 3.5 and less. Take Bufferin. It's easy on the stomach, and it put much more pain reliever in the bloodstream sooner.
This has been a CBS News special. 1975, a television album.
This broadcast has been sponsored by Bufferin, the headache tablet with special ingredients to give you fast relief and be easy on your stomach.
Celebrate New Year's Day on CBS with 3 events. The Cotton Bowl Festival Parade with host William Conrad, followed by the Tournament of Roses Parade. Then the clash of Georgia and Arkansas in the Cotton Bowl game.
That's New Year's Day on CBS.
This is the inside of a real estate agent's car. A Realty World agent. A specialist who values your time and decision. Before she seats you here, she'll seat you here. With RealScope, you'll see more homes in a few minutes than you can see by driving around all day. Instead of just taking you for a ride, Realty World helps you find the home you've been looking for. Realty World, a world of difference.
They're running down in Suffolk Downs. They're pounding the ground. Excitement surrounds you. They're running down at Suffolk Downs. Play on Major League Sports. Play on Major League Sports. Thoroughbred racing, it's a Major League Sport. A Major League Sport you can play.
Happy Kwanzaa from Boston 7.
Poisonous snakes are among the most efficient of all predators. Suffering no apparent disadvantage from their lack of legs, they can hunt with an economy of effort that few animals of any kind can match. The jungles of Africa and Asia are known for their deadly serpents, but though Americans may never want to boast about it, perhaps the most highly developed of all venomous snakes are found in the United States. In a moment, we'll explore the world of deadly American snakes.
The Animal Welfare Institute has published figures showing that in 1971, over 53 million dogs, cats, rabbits, sheep, and other animals were destroyed in laboratory research in the United States alone. The goals of the New England Anti-Vivisection Society are to reduce the staggering number of animals used for experimentation and eventually to eliminate the practice of vivisection. If you love animals, please write for our free literature today. Write Animals, 9 Park Street, Boston, 02108.
Good. Again. Are you?
Once it was against the law in some states to teach a black child to read or write. But the law didn't stop them from learning, and the law didn't change till 1863. For the past 30 years, the United Negro College Fund has helped 500,000 black students change the course of their lives at UNCF colleges. Thousands have become doctors, engineers, and teachers, perhaps changing the course of your life. But today, there just isn't enough money. And tomorrow...
We're sorry, but this course has been canceled.
Please, don't let this happen. Support the United Negro College Fund. A mind